The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on Clark Air Base in Luzon, Philippines, on January 31, 1945. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands shook slightly as he aimed his camera at the aircraft dominating the tarmac before him. An undamaged Mitsubishi G4M Betty Bomber, its tail number clearly visible, 766312. Something was fundamentally wrong with this design. No military air force would deliberately construct bombers this way. The fuselage caught the tropical light and gleamed brilliantly, its unmistakable cylindrical profile earning it the Allied nickname everyone used. Nearly 20 meters stretched from its nose to tail, the massive machine settled onto its tricycle landing gear like some enormous cigar abandoned on concrete. Those wings, spanning a full 25 meters from tip to tip, bore not a single mark of combat. The engines, 14-cylinder radials, each cranking out 1 to 500 horsepower, appeared absolutely pristine. This wasn't salvage pulled from wreckage scattered across jungle floors. This was an intact, fully operational aircraft left behind when its crew fled during the American advance. Yet what truly commanded McCoy's attention, what would fundamentally alter how America understood Japanese aviation strategy, lay hidden inside. When he squeezed through the inspection panels built into the wings, he found it immediately. The fuel tanks possessed no protection whatsoever, no self-sealing rubber, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems. Nothing. Just fragile aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, all that separated thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. McCoy had spent years examining damaged Japanese aircraft scattered across the Pacific Theater. He'd seen crashes, burned-out shells, stripped wreckage. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for this moment. This abandoned bomber, captured intact when Clark Field fell to American forces, would reveal a design philosophy so utterly foreign to Western military thinking that it would take analysts months to fully grasp what it meant. The mathematical conclusions drawn from this single discovery would rewrite American tactical doctrine and reshape aircraft design for the remainder of the war. Every conviction American pilots held about Japanese capabilities, every assumption about what Japanese engineers would sacrifice for performance, every calculation about how much the imperial military valued crew survival, all of it would be systematically proven wrong by what this one pristine aircraft contained. The story leading to this moment began 4 years earlier, when smoke still climbed into the sky above Pearl Harbor on December 8, 1941. From bases across Formosa, 82 G4M bombers and 26 G3M bombers rose into the morning air. Their destination was Clark Field itself, the hub of American air operations throughout the Philippines. The attack achieved absolute tactical surprise. The Japanese formation arrived at 12:35 in the afternoon, cruising at 20,000 feet, altitude that placed them beyond the reach of every American anti-aircraft battery. During that first wave, 27 bombers released 636 bombs across runways and facilities. Immediately after, 0 fighters came screaming in at treetop level, their machine guns methodically destroying every American aircraft that the bombing had failed to obliterate. Of the 17 B-17 flying fortresses parked on the ground, 12 were completely destroyed. Virtually every P-40 Warhawk lay burning and twisted. 45 minutes. That's all it took to eliminate American air power in the Philippines. Lieutenant James Harrington, among the handful of American pilots who survived, watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation banked north and disappeared. Years later, he recorded his observations. "What got to me was their approach," he wrote. "Perfect formation, flying high. Totally beyond anything we could reach. Then their fighters dropped down and tore us to pieces. We couldn't get a single plane airborne, but those Betty bombers themselves left without a scratch. The few American fighters that managed to scramble into the air found nothing but empty sky ahead of them. The Japanese had proven their bombers possessed exceptional range, striking from bases over 460 miles away, a distance no American bomber could yet accomplish. In its opening year of combat, the Betty demonstrated devastating effectiveness. 2 days later, on December 10, 1941, 26 G4M bombers joined with older G3M Nell bombers in an assault on a British naval task force centered around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. The attack commenced around 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in waves, their coordination stunning British observers. The Betty bombers carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms with a 205-kilogram warhead. These torpedoes had been engineered specifically for shallow water operations, running at depths allowing them to strike vessels even in coastal zones. The Japanese pilots delivered their torpedo runs with precision that shocked every British eye watching from those ships. The Prince of Wales, a battleship displacing 43,000 tons and representing the newest pinnacle of British naval engineering, absorbed at least 6 torpedo impacts, plus damage from level bombing runs. The underwater explosions tore massive cavities through the ship's hull. Water flooded through faster than damage control teams could respond. The battleship began listing dramatically. The Repulse, a battlecruiser designed during World War I but extensively modernized in the 1930s, took at least 4 torpedo hits while twisting desperately to evade the attacking aircraft. Her anti-aircraft gunners managed to bring down several Japanese machines, yet they couldn't prevent the coordinated torpedo attacks from striking home. The combined damage proved fatal for both vessels. Both ships rolled over and went under within hours. The Prince of Wales slipped beneath the surface at approximately 1,320 hours. The Repulse followed at approximately 1,333 hours. 841 British sailors perished. Escorting destroyers recovered the survivors. From first contact to final sinking, the entire engagement consumed less than 2 hours. For the first time in all of naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk by air power alone while operating in open ocean. The G4M Betty Bomber had accomplished what naval strategists and theorists had debated for decades. British naval supremacy throughout Asian waters evaporated in 90 minutes. Throughout the Pacific Theater and into early 1942, American and Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in virtually every major clash. The aircraft seemed to operate without opposition, striking targets at ranges that shattered conventional assumptions. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1 to 500 miles away, showcasing range capabilities that exceeded any Allied bomber's reach. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain spine, keeping constant pressure on Allied forces throughout the Southwest Pacific. They struck Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a span exceeding 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across impossible distances. That extraordinary operational range granted Japanese forces strategic adaptability that left Allied commanders scrambling for answers. American fighters stationed at forward positions lacked the range needed to intercept Betty bombers, departing from distant bases. Allied airfields faced attacks from Japanese bases themselves beyond Allied striking range. This capability gap meant Japanese forces attacked whenever and wherever they chose, while Allies struggled to mount effective retaliation. The advantage held strong through the war's opening 6 months. Betty bombers participated in nearly every Japanese offensive throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. They struck the Philippines, Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. They provided support for naval operations across the entire theater. They flew reconnaissance missions that exceeded what any Allied aircraft could accomplish. The Betty became synonymous with Japanese air power's reach and lethal capability. Yet everything hinged on limited Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could strike without fighters intercepting them, when they approached at altitude beyond anti-aircraft range, when they delivered their weapons and departed before fighters arrived, the aircraft became devastatingly effective. These exact conditions defined the first half of 1942, when Allied air strength remained limited and scattered across huge distances. That picture transformed by mid-1942. American fighter numbers climbed steadily. Wildcats gave way to Hellcats and Corsairs with superior performance. Pilot experience accumulated. Tactical techniques improved. Betty crews began reporting increasingly disturbing casualties. The transformation became undeniable on August 8, 1942. 23 G4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. What followed was brutal. 18 of those 23 Betty bombers burned and fell. Approximately 120 aviators died, the single worst G4M loss during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots kept reporting identical observations regardless of who was flying or where the engagement happened. The Betty erupted into flames with shockingly minimal damage. 2 or 3 hits anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread rapidly through every American squadron: Flying Cigar, One-Shot Lighter, Flying Zippo. Each name captured the Betty's terrifying characteristic: it transformed into fire with minimal provocation. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal commanding VF-17 with F-4U Corsairs, the Betty's reputation had shifted entirely. "The first time we encountered a Betty formation, we couldn't believe how easily they went down," Blackburn later reported. "You'd hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd ignite. We actively hunted them, knowing they represented some of the most vulnerable targets we'd ever face in Pacific skies." Yet the true scope of Betty vulnerability, the engineering decisions driving those catastrophic losses, remained mysterious until Americans began capturing intact examples for thorough technical examination. The first major intelligence breakthrough arrived in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, technical air intelligence units discovered Betty bombers in various conditions of preservation. Initial examinations confirmed everything pilots had reported. The fuel tanks sat completely unprotected. Aeronautical engineers attached to the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit, Southwest Pacific, conducted the first comprehensive analysis. Wing access panels exposed fuel cells with zero protective measures. Thin aluminum construction, no rubber sealant layer, no protective coating, no fire suppression systems. Every Betty examined at Buna displayed identical features. This wasn't combat damage or field modification, this represented standard Japanese design. The realization shocked everyone. American bombers by 1942 incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks universally. The B-17 Flying Fortress had included them from the B-17E model forward. The B-24 Liberator possessed them from the XB-24 prototype onward. Even fighter aircraft, including the P-38 and P-47, featured protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks employed layered rubber compounds that swelled when contacted by fuel upon bullet or shrapnel puncture, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight to any aircraft, yet dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine treated this weight penalty as essential and absolutely non-negotiable. Yet here sat Japan's primary land-based bomber, manufactured in thousands and deployed across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks offering absolutely zero protection. The weight eliminated by removing self-sealing systems, armor plating and fire suppression equipment became immediately obvious. But the cost in aviator lives was becoming equally apparent through casualty figures mounting steadily with each engagement. The Betty captured at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most thorough technical examination. McCoy and his teams invested 3 weeks dismantling and cataloging every system. Their resulting report, classified secret and distributed throughout all Allied air forces, detailed specifications that revealed both the Betty's remarkable capabilities and its catastrophic vulnerabilities. The G4M Model 1 specifications disclosed an aircraft engineered ruthlessly for range and speed. Empty weight came to 6,741 kilograms, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight reached 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity totaled 480 liters, distributed across 8 unprotected tanks, 4 positioned in each wing, located in the wing's center section where they faced maximum vulnerability to combat damage. Top speed achieved 428 kilometers per hour, or roughly 265 miles per hour. Maximum range exceeded 6,034 kilometers, surpassing 3,700 miles. Service ceiling reached 8,500 meters. The crew numbered 7: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system design proved particularly revealing. 8 tanks arranged in 4 pairs occupied positions along the wing's longitudinal axis where the wing connected to the fuselage. This arrangement maximized fuel storage by utilizing the wing's thickest structural section, yet it positioned every tank directly in the path of enemy fire during combat. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. The aluminum construction provided zero protection. Missing self-sealing compounds meant even tiny punctures would leak fuel constantly. American engineers calculated the weight saved through eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. That weight savings translated directly into additional fuel capacity and expanded range, yet the vulnerability cost proved equally calculable. Combat reports demonstrated that Betty bombers struck anywhere in the wing area would explode with near certainty. The unprotected tanks created what engineers termed a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. These specifications traced back to design choices made in September 1937 when the Japanese Navy released requirements that would define the G4M's entire existence. Top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of 4,722 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers while carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. Those requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy in the late 1930s. Japan's empire sprawled across vast Pacific distances, naval bases separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy required bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond carrier aircraft range. Bombers that could operate from land bases supporting naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell dramatically short. The G3M Nell bomber, then in service, possessed maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers, including the B-17, offered even more limited range in their early versions. No bomber anywhere in the entire world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. Those Navy requirements weren't arbitrary choices. They were calculated based on distances Japanese forces would require covering in any future Pacific conflict. The distances were daunting. From bases like Rabaul to the Philippines stretched 460 miles. From Rabaul to Guadalcanal meant crossing 600 miles of open ocean. Across the entire Pacific, from Japan's home islands to potential targets, the distances multiplied into thousands of miles that no existing aircraft could reliably traverse. For Japan to project meaningful military power across such vast stretches of ocean, they needed a bomber unlike anything else in the world, an aircraft that could carry a substantial weapons load while flying farther than any competitor's aircraft. Such a machine would hand Japan strategic capabilities that no other nation on Earth possessed at that time. Yet those very requirements revealed something troubling about Japanese military thinking. The specifications were built on assumptions about how future warfare would unfold, and nearly every single one of those assumptions would turn out to be tragically, catastrophically wrong. Japanese leaders believed that surprise attacks and seizing the initiative would keep long-range bombers safe from serious threats. They thought enemy fighter aircraft would have limited range and numbers, unable to challenge Japanese bombers far from friendly territory. Most crucially, they assumed victory would come quickly, before enemy factories could manufacture the overwhelming industrial might that modern war demands. All of these beliefs would prove devastatingly false. The engineer chosen to make the impossible happen was Kiro Honjo, who took command of Mitsubishi's design team after replacing Joji Hattori. Honjo had spent years in early 1930s Germany studying bomber design at Junkers, where he soaked up everything about European aeronautical engineering and manufacturing methods before returning to Japan with that invaluable knowledge. He grasped immediately that satisfying what the Navy wanted would require sacrifices that Western air forces would never dream of accepting. At Mitsubishi's sprawling Nagoya facilities, Honjo put together a team of brilliant engineers to wrestle with the design challenges ahead. They scrutinized every piece of the bomber, calculating how many kilograms they could afford for each component and system without compromising the whole. They examined bombers from various nations, searching for ways to shed weight while keeping the structure sound and airworthy. They experimented with innovative construction methods and materials that might trim weight without sacrificing strength. The math was straightforward and unforgiving. To reach the range the Navy demanded, the aircraft had to carry tremendous quantities of fuel. Each liter of aviation fuel weighs roughly 0.8 kilograms. At full capacity, 4,180 liters of fuel translated into approximately 3,800 kilograms of dead weight before the aircraft even carried weapons or ammunition. To push this heavy fuel load through the air at the required speed meant keeping everything else as light as humanly possible. Every single kilogram of empty weight became an enemy of either range or bomb-carrying capacity. These two goals fought directly against each other. The fuel itself was heavy, and so was everything designed to keep crews and vital systems alive during combat. Armor plating alone, the kind needed to shield the pilot and vital aircraft systems, would weigh hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks required rubber compounds and extra structure that added weight significantly. Fire suppression equipment added more pounds. Every redundant safety system added more mass. The cumulative weight of genuine protection would make it impossible to achieve the performance the Navy demanded. Honjo made a choice that would haunt the G4M bomber for its entire operational life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be simple, unprotected aluminum. No self-sealing rubber compounds, no armor around the fuel cells, no fire suppression systems except basic fire extinguishers, no backup safety systems. Every kilogram saved this way would go toward fuel capacity, maximum range, and meeting what the Navy specified. The decision came with full knowledge of its consequences. Honjo's engineers understood exactly what vulnerabilities would result. They calculated precisely how dangerous unprotected fuel tanks would be in combat, recognizing that hits to the wings would likely become fatal to the entire aircraft. Still, they also recognized a hard truth. There was simply no way to meet Navy requirements with the technology available unless they accepted these risks. The real choice was between building an aircraft that met performance standards but had known weaknesses, or building one that offered better protection but failed the Navy's demands. The Navy had chosen performance, and Honjo delivered it. On October 23, 1939, the first G4M prototype climbed into the sky. The aircraft achieved every single performance specification the Navy had written down. The speed numbers exceeded expectations, the range surpassed what planners had projected, and the weapons payload satisfied operational needs. Production began immediately as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber, manufactured at Mitsubishi plants in Nagoya. The early production variants, designated G4M Model 1, started reaching combat units in April 1941. By the time December 1941 arrived, roughly 180 G4Ms were operational with the Japanese Navy. These aircraft would become the foundation of Japanese land-based air power throughout the Pacific War. When the Betty made its combat debut at Clark Field and in subsequent operations, the wisdom of Honjo's emphasis on performance became immediately apparent in the conditions of early 1942. As long as formations faced minimal fighter opposition, achieved surprise, and operated beyond where enemy fighters could reach, the Betty was devastatingly, almost terrifyingly effective. Its extraordinary range allowed it to strike from bases enemies thought were safe. Its speed meant it could penetrate target areas and withdraw before threats could assemble. Its weapons delivered genuine destruction. Yet these advantages rested entirely on one fragile assumption, that Betty formations would meet little serious resistance. Everything changed the moment American fighter strength grew. Everything fell apart when interception became routine. Everything unraveled when combat became constant and prolonged. Every design decision prioritizing range over armor became a mechanism of death for the men flying these aircraft. The Guadalcanal campaign exposed the catastrophic flaw in the Betty's entire design philosophy. Between August and October 1942, Japanese lost more than 100 G4M bombers, along with their crews, in a sustained, devastating bloodletting that Japan's air forces could never recover from. On August 8 alone, a single mission resulted in 18 of 23 aircraft destroyed, taking approximately 120 flyers with them into the ocean. This horrifying pattern repeated with mechanical consistency. Betty formations would launch from Rabaul, fly 600 miles to Guadalcanal, engage American fighter pilots, and suffer catastrophic destruction. August 9th brought additional losses. August 10th brought more. By month's end, the 4th Air Group had been shattered and ceased functioning as an organized unit, and September offered no relief whatsoever. Betty formations kept attacking American positions at Guadalcanal, and American fighters kept slaughtering them by the dozens. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. To contest American control of the island, Japanese forces had to strike American positions constantly. The Betty Bomber was the only tool Rabaul could use to deliver meaningful destruction from such distance. Yet every single mission exacted a toll that Japan could not replace. As October progressed, the nightmare continued. American fighter strength climbed as more squadrons arrived at Henderson Field. Pilot experience accumulated, making American flyers increasingly lethal. Tactical doctrine evolved to exploit every Betty weakness with deadly efficiency. Losses accelerated even as the number of available bombers dwindled. By November, as the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended with Japanese forces withdrawing, Betty losses had exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties had approached 700 dead men. The cost was utterly unsustainable. Japan's finest land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by the very vulnerabilities built into its design. It transformed from a feared weapon into what American pilots called easy meat. Japanese planners had braced for casualties because all warfare involves them, but the scale of destruction far exceeded anything they had projected. The unprotected fuel tanks that granted 6,000-kilometer range also guaranteed that any significant hit to the wings or fuselage would be fatal to the aircraft and everyone aboard. There existed no middle ground, no damaged bombers limping home on one engine, no survivors ejecting from crippled but still flying aircraft. A Betty bomber either returned untouched or erupted in flames and plummeted into the sea. No other possibility existed. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers acknowledged that something had to change. Beginning with 663 aircraft manufactured in March 1943, 30mm sheets of rubber were attached beneath the wing surfaces where fuel tanks sat vulnerable. These were not true self-sealing tanks in the modern sense. They represented a compromise, adding minimal weight while providing only partial protection against fuel leaking from bullet holes. The modification reduced maximum speed by 9 km per hour. Fuel range dropped by 315 kilometers, yet crew survival rates showed virtually no meaningful improvement. The rubber sheets could slow how fast fuel escaped from small-caliber rounds. They could not prevent fires erupting from larger-caliber machine gun bullets or cannon shells. They could not stop the explosion when shrapnel ignited fuel vapor inside the tanks. The core vulnerability remained fundamentally unchanged. Japanese designers attempted more thorough protection when they introduced the G4M Model 3 in October 1944. This version actually incorporated real self-sealing fuel tanks, though tank capacity had to drop to 4,490 liters to make room for the leak-sealing materials inside. This reduced maximum range to just 3,040 kilometers. A staggering loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original Model 1. Approximately 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were completed before the war ended. By the time this modification arrived, it was already far too late. American air superiority in late 1944 was so complete that no amount of fuel tank protection would have allowed Betty bombers to operate with any effectiveness. The war's outcome had already been sealed. The Betty's fatal vulnerabilities became so infamous that American forces eventually weaponized it symbolically, using the aircraft in operations that underscored the terrible risks Japanese crews confronted. On April 18, 1943, a Betty bomber became the instrument through which Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto met his death in an engagement demonstrating both American intelligence prowess and the aircraft's inherent deadliness. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese radio traffic, revealing that Yamamoto would fly from Rabaul to Bougainville on April 18th. The admiral would travel aboard a G4M with fighter escort accompanying him. 17 P-38 Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron received orders to intercept the flight, though only 16 aircraft actually participated in the mission after one pilot blew a tire on takeoff and another experienced drop tank malfunctions. The mission demanded absolutely extraordinary precision. The P-38s had to fly over 400 miles at wave-top altitude to evade radar, navigate across featureless ocean with no landmarks visible, and arrive at the exact spot at the exact moment calculated for the intercept. Any navigation error, any timing mistake, meant the entire mission would fail. The narrow window when Yamamoto's aircraft could be successfully engaged would close quickly. The P-38s launched from Guadalcanal at 07:25 in the morning. They flew at 50 feet above the water for over 400 miles, maintaining absolute radio silence. Navigation relied on dead reckoning and precise timekeeping. The formation reached the calculated intercept point with precision that would achieve legendary status in aviation history. At 09:34, exactly on schedule and precisely 1 minute ahead of the calculated intercept time, the P-38 pilots spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying low altitude with 60 Zero fighters as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber separated from their formation to engage the bombers, while other P-38 pilots kept the Zero fighters occupied. Barber targeted the lead Betty, which carried Admiral Yamamoto himself. The bomber took multiple hits in the wing area, where fuel tanks sat completely unprotected. The aircraft exploded in flames and crashed deep in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day, the Admiral dead from injuries sustained in the impact. The second Betty bomber also crashed into the jungle, killing all aboard. The entire operation demonstrated multiple dimensions of Allied superiority. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese communications. American planning officers had calculated intercept timing with 1-minute accuracy across 400 miles of open ocean. American fighter pilots had executed the mission flawlessly despite extraordinary navigation challenges. And the Betty's unprotected fuel tanks ensured that successful interception would be absolutely fatal. Yamamoto's bomber could not have survived once it came under attack. The fuel tanks made survival impossible. The Betty's vulnerability reached perhaps its most striking demonstration on March 21, 1945. 18 G4M bombers departed from Kanoya Air Base, each carrying an MXY-7 Oka rocket bomb attached underneath its fuselage. The Oka was a piloted rocket-powered aircraft equipped with a 200-kilogram warhead, designed as a manned suicide weapon against American ships. The Oka pilots would guide their aircraft into American vessels at speeds exceeding 650 kilometers per hour. When a 1,200-kilogram warhead struck a ship at such velocity, the explosion would destroy nearly any vessel in the Pacific Fleet. But the entire plan hinged on the Betty bombers surviving long enough to get within 20 kilometers of their targets before releasing the Oka aircraft. The Betty pilot would then radio his launch signal, and the Oka pilot would fire the rocket motor and begin his final dive. The formation lifted off from Kanoya around 14:30 in the afternoon. The 18 G4Ms flew in tight formation with fighter escort protecting them, heading toward American naval forces positioned off Okinawa. Each bomber carried an Oka weapon mounted beneath its fuselage, adding substantial weight and creating extra drag that slowed the entire formation and reduced maneuverability drastically. The bombers became even more helpless than they normally were, incapable of evasion or quick maneuvering while burdened with the Oka weapons. American radar stations detected the incoming formation at approximately 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters launched from USS Hornet scrambled to intercept the Japanese aircraft. The Hellcats intercepted the Japanese formation well before it could approach the release range needed for the Oka weapons. What followed was a systematic slaughter. American fighters attacked the Japanese bombers methodically. The Betty aircraft, already vulnerable under normal conditions, proved completely helpless while carrying the external Oka weapons. The added weight prevented any kind of evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created enormous drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be catastrophic and fatal. One by one, the bombers exploded and tumbled out of the sky into the ocean. Not a single Betty survived to reach the release distance. Not one Oka weapon ever launched toward an American ship. The attack cost the lives of 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots, all dead for nothing. The mission epitomized everything fundamentally wrong with the Betty. Here was an aircraft engineered to strike targets thousands of kilometers away, yet it couldn't survive long enough to release its weapons when real opposition materialized. All that incredible range, all those stunning distances the plane could cover, none of it mattered the moment the fuselage exploded before the crew could reach their target. On August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the final Betty bombers took to the skies. 2 aircraft, painted brilliant white with green crosses, lifted off from Sugi airfield, carrying Japan's delegation to discuss surrender terms with the Allies. These weren't bombers anymore, they'd been transformed into something else entirely. The symbolism ran deep and unmistakable. White paint and green crosses signaled peaceful intentions to any observer. Weapons of war had become vehicles of diplomacy. But those identifying marks meant something more profound. The designations Bataan 1 and Bataan 2 referenced the location where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942, one of the most shattering defeats in American military history. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those names carried Japan's own surrender delegation toward an American airfield. Lieutenant Den Sudo piloted one of these historic flights, guiding a G4M transport variant that had been converted from a standard bomber frame. The distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration remained unchanged, but passengers and cargo now occupied the space where bombs once hung. The crew dressed in formal uniforms rather than flight suits. No weapons filled the bomb bay. No ammunition lined the fuselage. Nothing military whatsoever except what the flight itself required. The journey from Sugii to the rendezvous point stretched approximately 1,000 kilometers, well within the Betty's reach, even in transport configuration. American fighters shadowed the white bombers throughout the entire flight, maintaining protective vigilance while ensuring the aircraft stayed precisely on course. The escort served dual purposes, guaranteeing safe passage while preventing any possibility of deviation. The circle had closed. The bomber that ripped into American air power at Clark Field in December 1941, opening the Pacific War with devastating surprise, now carried Japan's emissaries at the war's conclusion. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese aerial reach and devastating capability now symbolized Japan's defeat and surrender to Allied terms. Production figures told a story of the Betty's critical importance to Japanese operations and the staggering price of its design philosophy. Approximately 2,414 aircraft rolled off production lines across all variants, though some documentation indicates numbers approaching 2,435 when including every prototype and specialized subtype. The differences in total numbers reflected various counting methods for prototypes, specialized models, and transport conversions. The G4M Model 1 dominated production runs, with roughly 1,092 aircraft built between 1941 and early 1943. These bombers carried unprotected fuel tanks holding 4,080 liters, a vulnerability that would define the aircraft's entire combat history. Top speed reached 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range stretched to an astounding 6,034 kilometers, making it the longest-ranged bomber operating anywhere on Earth. Yet this incredible performance came at a catastrophic cost: complete absence of any defensive systems or crew protection. The G4M Model 2 appeared from 1943 through 1945 with approximately 142 examples produced. Increased fuel capacity expanded to 6,490 liters, pushed maximum range even further. Top speed climbed slightly to 437 kilometers per hour. Yet the fundamental curse remained unchanged. Fuel tanks still lacked any protective systems whatsoever. Performance improvements meant nothing without addressing survivability. Only the G4M Model 3, designated Model 34, finally incorporated self-sealing fuel tanks. Production began in October 1944. but mere months of manufacturing yielded only 60 to 91 completed aircraft before the war ended. The self-sealing compounds consumed precious volume, reducing fuel capacity to 4,490 liters and cutting maximum range to 3,040 kilometers, a loss exceeding 2,000 kilometers compared to the Model 1. The modification arrived impossibly late and in laughably small numbers to influence any combat outcomes. Transport variants added another 30 aircraft, including the G4M Model 1 transport that carried Japan's surrender delegation. Mitsubishi factories had operated at ferocious pace during 1943, churning out approximately 100 aircraft monthly. Production collapsed in 1944 and 1945 as American bombing devastated Japanese industry and resources shifted desperately toward fighter production for homeland defense. Over 4 years of warfare, Mitsubishi delivered roughly 2,400 Bettys to Japanese Navy units scattered across the Pacific Theater. The bombers appeared in every major campaign, participated in every significant naval engagement, and struck targets across thousands of kilometers. Yet production statistics revealed only half the story. Loss rates told the rest. Few Bettys survived the entire war. The overwhelming majority burned and fell from the sky, consumed by fires that unprotected fuel tanks made virtually inevitable. By August 1945, only a handful of operational Bettys remained in service. An aircraft that had numbered in the hundreds during 1942 had been reduced to mere dozens by a rate of attrition no amount of production could replace. Crew casualty statistics proved equally devastating, though exact numbers remain elusive from available historical records. What remains certain, thousands of Japanese aviators perished in Betty bombers, their deaths rendered nearly inevitable by the aircraft's fundamental design vulnerability. Unprotected fuel tanks created a brutal calculus where survival depended entirely on avoiding combat damage. Once struck, Betty bombers rarely made it home. Once engulfed in flames, they never survived. The crews understood these odds with complete clarity and flew anyway because military discipline and cultural obligation demanded acceptance of the risk regardless of consequence. Surviving Betty aviators spoke with unanimous voice on this subject. Those unprotected fuel tanks transformed survival into pure chance. Skill meant nothing. Tactical brilliance meant nothing. Courage meant nothing. The fundamental vulnerability built into every airframe rendered all three irrelevant. Flight Petty Officer Masao Sato completed 28 combat missions before transfer to training duties, and his words captured the essence with brutal precision. The Betty was a magnificent aircraft that asked us to die for its range. We flew it because we were ordered to fly it. We died in it because that was what it was designed to make us do. The contrast with Allied bomber design philosophy couldn't have been starker. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured extensive armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot, with steel plates ranging from 0.3 to 0.31 inches thick. Armored bulkheads safeguarded crew positions throughout the entire fuselage. The bombardier's compartment included armored glass. Waist gunner stations had protective shields. Self-sealing fuel tanks came standard from the B-17C model forward, introduced in 1941. The B-25 Mitchell incorporated similar comprehensive protection schemes. Pilot and co-pilot seats featured armor backing. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds from early production batches. The B-25's empty weight of approximately 900 kilograms reflected a substantial penalty, roughly 2,000 kilograms heavier than the Betty, for protection systems despite operating in a similar role and size class. American designers accepted this weight penalty without hesitation, treating it as absolutely necessary. Wartime studies demonstrated crew protection effectiveness with precision. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% down to 8%, a reduction exceeding 75% in chest wound deaths. Self-sealing fuel tanks decreased fire-related casualties by comparable margins. Aircraft equipped with protected fuel systems showed survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than unprotected competitors when damaged during combat operations. Protected crew positions increased survival likelihood by shielding personnel from shrapnel and small arms rounds. Armored glass prevented pilot casualties from head-on attacks. Compartmentalized fuselage designs prevented fire or damage in one section from spreading catastrophically throughout the aircraft. This comprehensive protection philosophy reflected American military doctrine that experienced crews represented assets more valuable than replaceable aircraft. The weight cost for this philosophy exceeded 1,000 pounds on most American bombers. Yet American industrial capacity accommodated this weight penalty while maintaining production numbers. Factories produced over 12,000 B-17s and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. Industrial capacity allowed American forces to field enormous numbers of protected bombers without sacrificing operational capability. Japanese military leadership reached profoundly different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected a calculation that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. This philosophy assumed achieving surprise and maintaining initiative would provide sufficient protection. It assumed enemy opposition would remain limited. It assumed the war would conclude quickly and decisively. All these assumptions collapsed catastrophically wrong within months. By mid-1942, American fighter strength had increased to levels making Betty interception routine. By late 1942, American pilots had learned to exploit every vulnerability the aircraft possessed. By 1943, Betty formations suffered such devastating losses that missions became suicide operations. By 1944, Betty bombers could barely function in daylight operations against American opposition. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire and loss. Every advantage making the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once genuine sustained combat began. Range disappeared as an asset when bombers exploded before reaching target distance. Speed provided no advantage when fighters intercepted from distant bases. Payload became meaningless when formations disintegrated before weapon release. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field in January 1945 revealed the complete story. Those unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy represented no oversight, no temporary expedient, no design failure. They represented deliberate engineering choice by designers who believed range mattered more than survival. Japanese engineers had built exactly what their specifications demanded: an aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, optimized for minimum weight to achieve required performance. Tanks lacked protection because protection would have prevented achieving specified performance requirements. The decision made perfect sense within 1937 technological constraints and 1937 assumptions about future warfare, but those assumptions shattered under the reality of sustained combat against an adversary possessing unlimited industrial capacity and growing technological advantage. The Betty bomber symbolized Japanese willingness to accept catastrophic casualties, pursuing tactical advantage. It evidenced a military culture prioritizing mission accomplishment over crew survival. When American engineers examined the intact Betty at Clark Field, they studied more than enemy aircraft design. They witnessed physical manifestation of choices made years earlier, choices prioritizing capability over survival that would cost thousands of Japanese aviators their lives. Those unprotected fuel tanks were not accident. They were decision. The Betty served from the war's opening day to its final moment. It sank capital ships, it devastated air bases, it ranged across distances no other bomber could approach. Yet its ultimate legacy lived in loss statistics exceeding all projections. The aircraft that opened the war destroying American air power at Clark Field ended the war carrying Japan's surrender delegation in white-painted aircraft marked with green crosses. The crew of tail number 76312 had abandoned their aircraft during the American advance, surviving by walking away from an aircraft whose design made combat survival nearly impossible. Most Betty crews received no such fortune. They flew knowing the danger. They climbed into unprotected bombers and crossed vast Pacific distances. They died in overwhelming numbers, consumed by fires that aircraft design made inevitable. The Betty's story ultimately concerns the price of capability without protection. Performance alone cannot guarantee success when purchased with crew survival. That extraordinary 6,000-kilometer range meant nothing when aircraft couldn't survive the final 100 kilometers to target. The impressive 428 km/h speed provided no advantage when American fighters intercepted from distant bases guided by radar warning systems. One-ton payload capacity became irrelevant when formations disintegrated before weapon release. Most importantly, the Betty reveals that military technology divorced from realistic combat assessment produces weapons killing their own crews as efficiently as striking enemy targets. Design assumptions, assumptions about limited opposition and short warfare duration, proved catastrophically wrong within months of the Pacific War's beginning. By the time these assumptions collapsed, thousands of Betty bombers were already in service or production, and Japanese industry lacked capacity to replace them with better protected designs. Japanese designers understood the risks when making their 1937 and 1938 choices. They calculated weight penalties, they recognized vulnerabilities, they accepted trade-offs, believing performance advantages would prove decisive. They were wrong. Thousands of men paid the price with their lives. The Betty's legacy extends beyond aviation history into fundamental questions about aircraft design philosophy, military ethics, acceptable risk, and human life value in warfare. American designers answered by prioritizing protection even at performance cost. Japanese designers answered differently. It stands as evidence of what happens when capability takes priority over survivability, when range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations. Burning Betty bombers across the Pacific sky marked consequences of that philosophical difference, revealing how profoundly different nations approached Pacific warfare. American forces designed aircraft bringing crews home. Japanese forces designed aircraft reaching targets regardless of cost. Ultimately, the nation valuing crew survival built an air force sustaining indefinite operations. The nation accepting catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force destroying itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 76312 at Clark Field provided final proof of what Allied forces had long suspected. The Betty bomber wasn't poorly designed, it was brilliantly designed, achieving specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. In that single fact lies the entire story of why Japan lost the Pacific War.